Ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you for being here. Let me begin with a question. How long can an empire sustain itself when the very foundations of its power begin to crack? The United States, for nearly a century, has rested its global dominance not on the strength of its workers, not on the stability of its economy, but overwhelmingly on its unmatched military power, aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, bases in over 70 countries. These have been the tools with which Washington has projected authority. But today, that foundation faces a profound and perhaps irreversible challenge: China's strategic blow to U.S. military power. What is this blow? It is not a single missile nor a single maneuver, but rather a coordinated and deliberate shift in how China confronts U.S. hegemony. China has invested heavily in technologies that undercut the traditional advantage of the United States: hypersonic missiles that outrun and outmaneuver American defenses, cyber capabilities that can blind the U.S. military's communications in a heartbeat, and economic strategies that ensure allies of Washington think twice before lining up against Beijing. This is not simply military competition, it is structural. China has learned from decades of U.S. dominance, and now it has turned those lessons into weapons of its own. Think about it. The U.S. spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, yet for all this spending, it is not winning wars. Iraq, Afghanistan, these were quagmires that cost trillions, drained the public, and left the U.S. weaker than before. Meanwhile, China didn't fire a shot, but emerged economically stronger, technologically more advanced, and strategically more influential. The blow here is not only in weapon systems, but in exposing the limits of the American model of global power. And let us not forget the American people are footing the bill for this. While China builds high-speed rail and lifts hundreds of millions out of poverty, the U.S. builds weapon systems that fail their tests, that run over budget, and that enrich only a handful of defense contractors. So the blow is also internal. It is the recognition that the U.S. military machine serves Wall Street and the Pentagon brass far more than it serves the interests of ordinary Americans. Now here is the real hook. Empires often don't fall because someone invades them. They collapse because they rot from within while someone else patiently and strategically rises. That is the story of Britain when the United States rose. That is the story of Rome when its provinces grew restless. And, friends, that is very much the story of the United States today in the face of China's challenge. China's military innovation represents a turning point in the global balance of power, and it strikes directly at the foundation of U.S. military dominance. For decades, the American armed forces have relied on a combination of overwhelming firepower, advanced technology, and a globe-spanning network of bases to deter adversaries and project influence. Aircraft carriers sailing across the Pacific, fleets of fighter jets stationed in Allied territories, and sophisticated missile defense systems were seen as unchallengeable assets. Yet, in recent years, China has quietly and steadily developed new systems designed specifically to counter those advantages. These are not merely incremental improvements, but strategic game changers that threaten to make entire categories of U.S. military hardware vulnerable or even obsolete. The clearest example is China's rapid progress in hypersonic missile technology. Unlike conventional ballistic missiles, hypersonic weapons travel at speeds exceeding Mach 5 and maneuver unpredictably, making them extraordinarily difficult to detect and intercept for the United States, whose power projection relies heavily on large naval formations, particularly aircraft carrier strike groups. This development is nothing short of alarming. A single hypersonic missile capable of evading defenses can neutralize a carrier worth billions of dollars, along with the thousands of personnel on board. The symbolism here is powerful. The centerpiece of American dominance in the Pacific, the floating fortress that has for decades signaled supremacy, is no longer untouchable. Beijing has built weapons that can pierce the aura of invincibility around these icons of U.S. power. Beyond hypersonics, China has invested heavily in anti-access area denial strategies, often referred to in military circles as a 280. This doctrine focuses not on building a force equal to the United States in every respect, but on creating layered defenses that make it extremely costly for the U.S. to operate in waters or airspace near China's borders. Anti-ship ballistic missiles, long-range radar systems, integrated air defenses, and swarming drone technology all contribute to a fortress-like shield around the Chinese mainland. What this means in practical terms is that U.S. forces can no longer assume they can freely deploy forces right up to China's doorstep without significant risk. The days of uncontested dominance are slipping away. Equally important is China's mastery of cyber and electronic warfare capabilities. While hypersonic missiles grab headlines, the ability to disrupt or disable an adversary's communications, navigation, and targeting systems can be just as decisive. Modern militaries, and especially the U.S. military, depend on intricate digital networks linking satellites, command centers, ships, and aircraft. If those networks can be hacked, jammed, or otherwise compromised, the most advanced fighter jet or the most powerful naval vessel can quickly be rendered ineffective. China has built a reputation for both offensive and defensive cyber operations, giving it the ability to blind or confuse U.S. forces before a single missile is even launched. This combination of innovation is particularly effective because it exploits the weaknesses of an overextended empire. The United States has global commitments, hundreds of bases, and a military designed for worldwide engagement. China, by contrast, has concentrated its resources on the Western Pacific and on developing asymmetric tools that punch above their weight. Instead of matching the U.S. ship for ship or jet for jet, China has asked a different question. How do you neutralize those ships and jets at a fraction of the cost? The result is a set of technologies that undermine America's traditional strengths while conserving China's resources for other aspects of its rise, especially economic and diplomatic. What makes these innovations so strategically devastating is not just their technical sophistication, but the way they alter perceptions. Power is as much about credibility as about hardware. Allies and rivals alike are watching closely as China demonstrates the capacity to hold U.S. assets at risk. If Japan, South Korea, or Australia begin to doubt that the United States can reliably defend them in a conflict, their foreign policies will adjust accordingly. Countries in Southeast Asia conclude that China can deny American access to its near seas. They may align more closely with Beijing out of pragmatism. In short, every missile China builds reshapes not only the battlefield, but the diplomatic landscape. At the same time, these innovations expose the inefficiency and inertia of the U.S. defense establishment. Washington continues to spend hundreds of billions on programs like the F-35 fighter jet or the Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier, both of which face staggering cost overruns and questionable performance. These platforms were conceived in an era when technological superiority was assumed and when the enemy was presumed to lack the means to challenge them directly. Now, China's new systems cast serious doubt on the logic of those investments. A missile that costs a few $1 million can render irrelevant a carrier that costs over $13 billion. That economic imbalance alone signals a dangerous vulnerability for the United States. The point then is not that China has surpassed the US in every metric of military power. The United States still retains unmatched global reach and nuclear superiority. But the old guarantee that American forces could operate with impunity in any theater no longer holds. China's innovations are tailored, precise, and devastating in their implications. They show that the future of warfare will not be decided solely by who spends the most, but by who adapts the fastest and designs strategies that turn the adversary's strengths into weaknesses. In that sense, China's military innovation is not just a technical achievement, but a strategic blow that strikes at the heart of American power projection. The limits of U.S. military power have become increasingly visible over the past 2 decades. And nowhere is this clearer than in the repeated failures to achieve decisive outcomes in conflicts such as Iraq and Afghanistan. For generations, Americans were told that their country's vast defense budget, larger than the combined military spending of the next 10 nations, guaranteed victory in any engagement. Yet, the reality has been far different. Despite deploying state of the art aircraft, precision guided missiles, and an enormous logistical apparatus, the U.S. has struggled not only to win wars, but even to define what victory would mean in the modern era. This disconnect between spending and results has profoundly undermined America's credibility as the world's dominant military power. Take Afghanistan as a case study. The U.S. entered in 2001 with overwhelming firepower, quickly dismantled the Taliban government, and proclaimed success. But what followed was not stability or democracy, but 2 decades of costly occupation, insurgency, and failure to achieve sustainable governance. By the time U.S. forces finally withdrew in 2021, the Taliban had returned to power almost as swiftly as they were removed 2 decades earlier. Trillions of dollars had been spent, tens of thousands of lives had been lost, and yet the geopolitical outcome was a humiliating stalemate that exposed the limits of American force. Iraq tells a similar story. In 2003, the U.S. invaded under the banner of removing weapons of mass destruction and spreading democracy. The regime of Saddam Hussein fell quickly again, demonstrating the overwhelming might of American military technology in conventional battle. But what came after was chaos, sectarian conflict, the rise of insurgencies, the spread of extremist groups like ISIS, and the erosion of U.S. credibility worldwide. The occupation revealed that defeating an enemy's army is not the same as achieving long-term political stability. America's vast arsenal could destroy cities, topple governments, and occupy territory, but it could not build functional institutions or win the allegiance of populations. These failures are not simply accidents of poor planning or misguided leadership. They reveal structural weaknesses in the way the United States has relied on its military. For decades, policymakers assumed that superior technology and overwhelming spending would translate automatically into global control. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan proved otherwise, showed that military supremacy on paper does not guarantee favorable political outcomes in practice. Insurgencies, asymmetric warfare, and the determination of local populations can render the most sophisticated weapons systems ineffective. $1 trillion budget cannot purchase legitimacy, nor can it substitute for genuine diplomatic or economic engagement. The consequences extend beyond the battlefields themselves. Every failed campaign chips away at the aura of American invincibility. Allies begin to question whether the U.S. can actually deliver on its security promises. Rivals observing the difficulties are emboldened to test Washington's resolve in other arenas. The image of an unstoppable superpower, once a cornerstone of U.S. influence, has been replaced by the perception of a nation trapped in endless wars that yield little strategic gain. This shift in perception is itself a profound strategic setback. Domestically, the limits of military power are also visible in the staggering costs borne by ordinary Americans. While trillions were spent on wars abroad, infrastructure at home deteriorated, wages stagnated, and inequality deepened. Citizens watched as their government poured resources into conflicts that produced little benefit for them. While health care, education, and housing crisis went unresolved, the contrast between soaring defense budgets and declining quality of life has sharpened public skepticism toward the idea that military power alone can secure national strength. This internal erosion is as significant as any external defeat. Another critical dimension of these limits lies in the mismatch between the U.S. military's global commitments and its actual capabilities. With bases in over 70 countries and responsibilities across multiple continents, the American military is stretched thin. Every deployment creates vulnerabilities elsewhere. Every new conflict risks overextension. Unlike past empires, which could retreat and consolidate, the United States has tied its prestige to maintaining influence everywhere at once. This overreach magnifies the significance of every setback because withdrawal from one region is seen not as tactical repositioning, but as evidence of decline. What China has observed in these failures is instructive. While the U.S. exhausted itself in protracted wars, China focused on developing capabilities that exploit these very weaknesses. It did not attempt to match American firepower globally, but instead built systems to deny U.S. forces easy access to its own neighborhood. Watching America spend trillions on wars with no clear victory, Beijing refined an approach that emphasizes patience, precision, and selective engagement rather than wasteful overextension. In this sense, the limits of U.S. military power are not just about battlefield outcomes, but about the strategic opportunities they create for rivals. In short, the U.S. may still outspend every other nation, but money has not translated into decisive success. The gap between military investment and political achievement has widened dramatically. The world has seen that overwhelming power can be blunted, bogged down, or rendered irrelevant by determined adversaries and complex realities on the ground. The perception of limitless strength has given way to recognition of deep vulnerabilities. And as long as Washington continues to rely on force as its primary tool of influence, these limits will only become more glaring. One of the most striking contrasts between the United States and China lies in how each nation has chosen to wield its resources. While Washington has funneled trillions of dollars, into military programs, defense contracts, and overseas interventions. Beijing has concentrated its efforts on building infrastructure, advancing technology, and strengthening its economic position both at home and abroad. This divergence is not simply a matter of accounting. It reflects two fundamentally different visions of power. The U.S. has long equated global leadership with military dominance, assuming that overwhelming force ensures influence. China, on the other hand, has embraced the idea that true power in the 21st century is grounded in economic resilience, technological innovation, and integration into global trade networks. This contrast is now reshaping international politics in ways that increasingly disadvantage the United States. China's domestic investments illustrate the point clearly. Over the past few decades, it has constructed the world's largest high speed rail network, built entire cities of modern housing, and poured resources into renewable energy projects, 5 grams technology, artificial intelligence, and advanced manufacturing. These are not isolated achievements, but part of a broader strategy to create an economy capable of sustaining long term growth and projecting influence without relying primarily on military confrontation. Each kilometer of rail, each research center, and each new technological breakthrough enhances China's ability to attract partners, secure resources, and assert itself on the world stage. By contrast, the U.S. spends vast sums on fighter jets, aircraft carriers, and missile systems that, while impressive, do little to improve the daily lives of its citizens or the sustainability of its economy. This economic focus has also translated into diplomatic leverage. Through initiatives such as the Belt and Road, China has extended its reach across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe by financing infrastructure projects, offering development loans, and building trade partnerships. These investments create relationships of dependence and mutual benefit that bind other countries to China's economic orbit. When Beijing builds a port in Africa, a railway in Central Asia, or a telecommunications network in Europe, it is not just exporting goods, it is exporting influence. Countries that rely on Chinese capital and technology are less likely to align with U.S. military agendas that might threaten those ties. Thus, China has found a way to extend its influence without firing a shot. Meanwhile, the American model of global engagement has increasingly come to resemble militarized management rather than cooperative development. U.S. foreign policy often relies on sanctions, military alliances, and threats of force to compel compliance. But sanctions can be circumvented, alliances can fray, and military threats can lose their bite when rivals offer alternative partnerships. China's economic outreach provides those alternatives. For many nations, the promise of new roads, ports, or digital networks is more tangible and attractive than the distant assurance of U.S. security guarantees. The result is a steady erosion of Washington's ability to dictate terms on the global stage. Another critical dimension of this contrast lies in how each approach affects domestic politics. In China, the benefits of economic development, though unevenly distributed, are visible to the population. Hundreds of millions have been lifted out of poverty, urban centers have modernized, and a sense of national progress has taken hold. This bolsters social cohesion and strengthens the legitimacy of the state in the United States. By contrast, military spending often produces little visible benefit for ordinary citizens. Defense contracts enrich corporations, and create pockets of employment, but they do not address crumbling infrastructure, inadequate health care, or the rising cost of living. For many Americans, the endless stream of military expenditures feels detached from their daily struggles, deepening frustration with the political system. It is also worth noting the symbolic power of these choices. A nation that builds railways, power grids, and advanced industries presents itself as a builder of the future. A nation that builds bombs and aircraft carriers presents itself as a defender of an order increasingly questioned by others. Global audiences, particularly in the developing world, pay attention to these distinctions. See China as a partner that can help deliver material progress, while the United States is viewed as a power that demands loyalty in exchange for military protection. Over time, that difference in perception translates into real political consequences as governments and societies choose their alignments based on who offers the most tangible benefits. The economic versus military contrast also highlights a deeper strategic reality. Military power, no matter how overwhelming, is inherently destructive and limited. It can impose costs, topple regimes, or deter attacks, but it cannot build lasting prosperity. Economic power, by contrast, is generative. It can create networks of trade, opportunities for growth, and enduring interdependence. China's strategy of emphasizing economic development at home and abroad leverages this generative quality. It ensures that even countries wary of Beijing's political model find it difficult to ignore the opportunities it provides. The U.S., trapped in its dependence on military dominance, has struggled to adapt to this new reality. The broader implication is that the foundation of global influence is shifting. For much of the 20th century, military might define superpower status. In the 21st century, economic integration, technological leadership, and infrastructure development are increasingly central. China's prioritization of these tools has positioned it to expand its influence in ways the U.S. cannot easily counter. While Washington continues to equate security with the size of its arsenal, Beijing demonstrates that security and influence can be achieved through roads, factories, and fiber optic cables. The world is watching, and many are concluding that the future belongs less to those who dominate battlefields than to those who build the systems on which daily life depends. The internal rot of the American empire is most visible in the relationship between the military industrial complex and the broader society it is supposed to serve. For the United States has justified its extraordinary levels of defense spending by invoking national security deterrence and the need to maintain global leadership. Yet the benefits of this vast expenditure accrue disproportionately to defense contractors, weapons manufacturers, and the small circle of lobbyists and policymakers who sustain them. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans see few tangible returns. This imbalance reveals not only economic inefficiency, but also a deeper moral and political decay within the structure of U.S. power. The Pentagon budget routinely exceeds $800 billion annually, and when one includes Veterans Affairs, nuclear programs, and related security spending, the total approaches or even surpasses $1 trillion. This enormous outlay is justified as necessary to keep America safe, yet much of it is consumed by weapons systems plagued with cost overruns, delays, and questionable effectiveness. Programs like the F-35 fighter jet or the Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier are emblematic of this problem. Billions poured into projects that often fail to deliver on their promises. These expenditures enrich major corporations such as Lockheed Martin Raytheon, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman, which in turn use their profits to fund lobbying campaigns, ensuring the cycle continues. It is a closed loop of wealth and influence, insulated from the realities of the average taxpayer who foots the bill. The costs of this system are not just financial, but social. Every dollar allocated to a weapons program is a dollar not spent on repairing roads, funding schools, or expanding healthcare. In cities across the country, bridges crumble, water systems fail, and public transit remains underdeveloped. Americans live in the shadow of infrastructure that was cutting edge in the 19th century, but has since fallen into disrepair. At the same time, they hear their leaders insist that the nation cannot afford universal health care, free higher education, or serious climate action. The contradiction is glaring. The richest country in the world finds endless resources for fighter jets and foreign wars, but pleads poverty when it comes to meeting the basic needs of its people. This reality has bred disillusionment and anger across the political spectrum. The military industrial complex also corrodes the political system itself. Campaign contributions and lobbying efforts from defense contractors ensure that Congress continues approving bloated defense budgets regardless of strategic necessity. Lawmakers whose districts depend on defense contracts become staunch advocates for weapons programs, even those deemed unnecessary by the Pentagon itself. The result is a political economy where war spending is less about actual defense and more about preserving jobs, contracts, and campaign donations. In such an environment, the incentives to seek peaceful solutions or invest in domestic renewal are consistently undermined by the financial interests of the arms industry. This dynamic fuels what President Eisenhower once warned of as the permanent war economy. In practice, it means the U.S. military is perpetually engaged somewhere in the world, ensuring a constant demand for weapons, munitions, and logistical support. Conflicts become not just geopolitical challenges, but business opportunities. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost trillions and left those nations shattered. Yet, for defense contractors, they were extraordinarily profitable. Each new crisis becomes an occasion for profit rather than an impetus for peace. This profit driven logic creates perverse incentives to sustain rather than resolve conflicts, leaving American foreign policy hostage to the interests of corporations rather than the needs of citizens. The internal decay also manifests in the growing disconnect between the rhetoric of military strength and the lived experience of Americans at home. Politicians boast of unparalleled defense capabilities while millions lack access to affordable health care, face housing insecurity, or work multiple jobs to make ends meet. Veterans return from service to inadequate medical care and limited economic opportunities. A stark reminder of how little the system values those who actually bear the human cost of endless wars. The glorification of military power in speeches and ceremonies contrasts sharply with the neglect of social well-being in daily life. This dissonance erodes faith in institutions and deepens cynicism about the motives of government. At a deeper level, the prioritization of military spending over social investment reflects a set of distorted values. The assumption that global dominance must be preserved at all costs has led to the steady militarization of national identity, where strength is equated with weaponry rather than with health, education, or equality. Ideology not only legitimizes the siphoning of resources away from public needs, but also conditions citizens to accept austerity at home as the price of empire abroad. The moral toll of this arrangement is evident in rising inequality, declining social trust, and the pervasive sense that the system is rigged in favor of elites. China, observing this internal rot, has positioned itself as a foil by prioritizing visible improvements in infrastructure, technology, and poverty alleviation. It offers its citizens a narrative of progress and demonstrates to the world that state power can be harnessed to build rather than merely to destroy. The contrast with the United States is increasingly stark. While Beijing unveils new rail lines, bridges, and digital networks, Washington unveils new bombers and warships. The former signals a commitment to future prosperity. The latter signals an attachment to outdated forms of dominance. For many countries, the choice of which model to engage with is becoming less about ideology and more about practicality. The internal rot of the U.S. system then is not hidden but visible for all to see. It is in the broken infrastructure, the neglected communities, the political capture by defense contractors, and the perpetual wars that enrich corporations while impoverishing society. This is the true cost of America's militarism, not only the erosion of its credibility abroad, but also the steady hollowing out of its social fabric at home. China's strategic challenge has forced the United States into a moment of reckoning, a point where it must confront the end of an illusion it has held for generations that military supremacy alone guarantees dominance. For much of the post-World War II era, the American establishment believed that overwhelming force backed by nuclear weapons and unmatched global reach would ensure not only security, but also compliance from allies and adversaries alike. The collapse of the Soviet Union seemed to confirm this belief, leaving the U.S. as the sole superpower. Yet, China's rise has steadily chipped away at this confidence, revealing that global influence in the 21st century cannot be secured by military might alone. The U.S. now faces a choice: continue down the path of endless militarism or shift toward reinvesting in its people, its economy, and its role in a multipolar world. The illusion of guaranteed dominance was sustained by decades of military interventions that went largely unchallenged. From Korea and Vietnam to the Persian Gulf, Washington assumed that sheer firepower would shape outcomes, even in failure, as in Vietnam. The American narrative held that these were aberrations rather than structural weaknesses. The failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, followed by the rapid technological rise of China, have forced a reassessment. Washington can no longer assume that its forces will operate with impunity, nor can it presume that allies will automatically fall in line behind U.S. leadership. The strategic blow delivered by China is not only in weapon systems, but in the psychological shift. It has triggered the recognition that American dominance is contested and, in some regions, already slipping. This moment of reckoning exposes the unsustainability of the U.S. approach. Military spending continues to consume vast portions of the federal budget, yet it delivers diminishing returns. The country spends more than any other nation on defense, but it cannot guarantee victory in asymmetric conflicts, nor can it deter the emergence of rival powers investing in alternative strategies. At the same time, the domestic consequences of this spending are increasingly difficult to ignore. Public infrastructure ages, inequality deepens,